Well, good afternoon, everybody. As you may have guessed, I'm very excited for this week's guest. Backed by popular demand, Matt was on a few months ago, actually. Maybe it's even longer than that now. We talked about supply chains and warehouses and the implications between the two of those. And there's a lot that's changed since the first time that we talked to Matt. So it'll be really interesting to get his insights into what's happening in the supply chain, the logistics space, and then some exciting news. Matt has actually joined the business. He's now an industrial real estate broker himself. So we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of the show. But I want to bring Matt on. Matt, how's it going? Thanks so much for joining me again.
Hey, Chad, thanks for having me on. It's great to be back.
I had so many good comments from the last time that you came on because you approach this from a unique standpoint in that you've got a very broad history and background of working directly in the supply chain industry in a number of different countries and different industries. So I think you've got a lot to offer for people that try to follow it on the fringe, perhaps don't follow it by working in it as you did, but are still very curious about it and understand that there's a lot of overlap between supply chain and logistics and the warehouse industry. They really go part and parcel together. So there's a lot to discuss, and a lot has changed since the first time that we talked, which was it might have been even 6-8 months ago if I start really trying to line up the dates. But a lot has changed. But I'll leave it to you to set the tone for what you're seeing right now in the supply chain industry, so perhaps where there's some bottlenecks that we still need to address. And we had a comment actually come in earlier, so we'll address that one in a second too. But just setting the stage, we're fall 2022. What's the state of the supply chain and logistics industry right now?
Sure. I actually just came from NAIOP, where this was a big thing of conversation. A couple of different supply chain forums and breakout sessions occurred. So a lot of discussion right now about what the current state of the market looks like, what it is, and what's going on globally with supply chain. And as you and I have talked about before, supply chain is so broad and complex that it often involves so many different aspects, whether it be transportation, inventory, ports, manufacturing, all kinds of different things. Rail has been a big part of this, or a big discussion point recently. And obviously the industrial real estate space is big in this supply chain puzzle as well. In fact, recently I just saw something that was talking about how supply chain, they're now talking about it becoming supply web, in terms of just because of the complexity and the globalization of it all. So there's a lot of different factors that are now influencing supply chain. And it'll just be interesting to see where we go from here, but a lot of interesting things happening.
So I bet people are familiar with some of the shortages that are happening right now, but there's ones that never cease to surprise me. And I was actually just talking to a banker this morning, and he said that one of his clients is a drywall business, and there's a lot of the gypsum or sheetrock or whatever it's called in different markets. There's a lot of that available, but the tape to actually hide the seam on it, that's in short supply, and it's very difficult to get this drywall tape. For myself, I know that you can't even get kids Tylenol right now. There's a global shortage of kids Tylenol, and I'm sure there's a plethora of other things where there's shortages and difficulties getting them. Why are we still having these supply chain bottlenecks 2.5 years since COVID started?
Well, it's interesting because there's a lot of different types of things happening right now. So if we were to talk about inventory itself, right now what we have going on is what they call the bullwhip effect, right? So in terms of inventory, real quick check, can you see me? You've been cutting in and out. I just want to make sure that your internet side on your side is good. Maybe it's just my connection.
Yeah, yours froze for a second there too, but I could still hear you. So that was good. There must just be an internet delay or something.
Okay, just want to make sure we're good. Yeah, so what we're seeing right now is the bullwhip effect, which is, I can't speak necessarily specific to that industry itself, but in a broad sense right now, what's happening with inventory is that we had this buying binge that happened during the COVID-19 era, right? Those 2 years, 2 3 years, where all of a sudden people that had money to go out and spend it for travel or for eating out, they couldn't do those things anymore. And that's a substantial amount of spend when you think about it. I have friends, I don't know about you, that go out and spend thousands of dollars on travel and then eating out as well. And all that stopped overnight. So all of a sudden, what do you do with that money? So e-commerce took off in an unprecedented way during COVID, right? So we had this boom in e-commerce, which then led to this boom in the industrial real estate space as well. But what happened during that time is that, and this is leading to that inventory question, all of a sudden people started forecasting and buying according to the binge during that time, right? So all of a sudden inventory started coming and hitting the United States in a way that was maybe not necessarily the correct read in terms of what was going on, because all that was happening during COVID. So for example, right now, we see that places like Target, Walmart, I even heard Nike, they're heavy on certain types of inventory because of that era. And so that's also leading to the warehouses being heavy on inventory right now. But that's what we call the bullwhip effect. So what's going to happen is right now we're also seeing this just in case inventory strategy, where nobody wants to be left with having their goods stuck on vessels out in the ports of LA Long Beach, for example, like we saw last Christmas season. So everybody's ordering in different ways to have more inventory here sooner, which we call just in case, instead of it being just in time, which we had before the pre-pandemic era. So that will shift probably back to the just in time inventory buying strategy. But for right now, we're still in that just in case method. But that's why we're seeing these warehouses so full of inventory. In fact, right now, what we heard recently was that a lot of these different places like Walmart and Target, et cetera, are heavy on certain types of inventory, like outdoor furniture, some of the home goods that were being bought during the pandemic era, and some casual wear that people were buying also during that time. So they're trying to figure out how to get rid of that stuff before the holidays. Some of that stuff was delayed also because it was caught in, on those vessels trying to make it to the warehouses. So it'll be interesting to see how, gets affected by all that. But right now, everybody's trying to figure out what the new normal is for inventory. And so it's going to be interesting to see, and different industries have been affected in different ways. And so, we would have to dig into the particulars of that one. But what you're seeing in a broader case is what I just mentioned.
Yeah, and to piggyback on those comments, I agree completely with what you're saying, is that e-commerce was already starting to ramp up pre-pandemic. And then when the pandemic hit, in many cases, some stores were closed. You couldn't even go to the physical stores for a period of time. So that led to this transition to ordering things online. And then now you add in the fact that all these companies are worried about stockouts, so they're adding more inventory. You've got this perfect storm where there is a dramatic increase in demand and the supply wasn't keeping pace with it. And that's like in ultra hot markets right now, it's sub 0.5% vacancy for industrial space, which at that level, there virtually isn't any industrial space because it's as soon as somebody
Correct.
announces that they're going to leave, it's backfilled by somebody else. In some of the more inland markets, you can see vacancy rates in the 5 to 7% range, but those ultra hot port markets are essentially 0% vacancy. Now, how do you see this unfolding as companies start rebalancing their needs, whether it is a shift from that just in case inventory that leads to more demand for warehouse space, going back to the just in time inventory? And a good example is Amazon. It's been in the news prominently that Amazon has essentially said they have enough warehouse space. They don't need any more. They've canceled some projects. They've subleased some projects. There's behind the scenes, they're still moving forward on a lot of other inventory, but at least publicly, the message that they're saying is that they don't need any more warehouse space. Do you see this starting to shift, a pattern in the demand starting to wane, or is this still going to be an issue because of these supply chain bottlenecks well into 2023?
Well, I think right now you have an interesting thing happening globally, right? So this it's more complex than just inventory ordering patterns. Right now, you also have what's happening right now, let's say with developers. You and I chatted about this earlier a couple weeks ago, is that a lot of developers right now are pencils down because they're waiting to see what the market does. So they're trying to see what inflation, what's going to happen with inflation and interest rates and things of that nature. So what you're seeing right now is that people have stopped building warehouses, or at least I shouldn't say completely, but they're pulling back, and they're reevaluating their strategies in terms of what makes sense for them to do in certain markets. There are certain markets that are still hot. What we're seeing right now is the Carolinas, for example. There's a lot of development happening there still, but in other markets that are traditionally still very hot markets for industrial space, there's a slowdown, and not only in terms of development itself, but also things are slowing down just practically too, because of getting materials to the warehouse locations that are being built in the first place. So there's an interesting thing happening there. Now, what's happening with Amazon is that what I heard is that they went from, in the pandemic era, they doubled their warehouse space that they had previous to that in 10, 15, 20 years previous to that. They doubled that space in that short period of time. And so they're reevaluating their strategy right now in terms of what they want to do. And so there is a return to store right now in terms of people their buying habits. What happened was, right now, what you hear a lot of people talk about is that industrial is the new retail, because it's so close to consumers. It's going to get there so quickly that I can sometimes order something, it's there same day, maybe the next day, or 2 to 3 days afterwards. And so some people are bypassing going to the store itself, or they go to the store and then go back home and buy online. Let's say clothes, for example. I wanted to try on 3 or 4 different colors, and so I go back home and order online rather than doing it in store. So even though that's happening, and we're seeing this, industrial is in the retail, people are returning to the store, and buying habits are shifting a little bit as people go back to restaurants. They go back and right now I have a lot of friends who are on vacation for fall break. So all of a sudden, buying habits do change a little bit. So you're seeing e-commerce not go away, of course, and it's going to be here to stay. And we've seen it progress in ways that were expedited, incredibly so, because of the pandemic era. But now those things are shifting. So that's what you're seeing Amazon react to, is those types of things. Now, the interesting thing is that you also now have Target and Walmart increasing their footprint in industrial, though, because they're also trying to get closer to consumers and trying to adapt in some ways that Amazon model. And what's interesting is transportation, by the way, is typically 10 times more costly than the cost of renting a space out for industrial real estate, right? So when you see that, you also see the strategy of getting closer to consumers as fuel costs go up. Insurance costs have gone up. I heard someone say recently it went up by 300%, somewhere in that range. Drivers are now having to adapt to this new, the DAC, the DAC safety regulations that are in place, where they no longer can do things, filling out their charts on paper, but it's now electronic. They now have to basically, they can only drive a certain amount of time, and they're having to obey those regulations. So it's all changing and shifting the way we do industrial real estate, and it's getting, the shift is closer and closer to the consumer. So right now it looks like Amazon is saying, I've got enough for right now. And you see these other corporations, these other companies saying, I need more to be closer to my consumer, to adapt to what's going on with transportation, to what's going on with consumer expectations as well, and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see how things pan out in the next couple of years. But from what I hear in terms of, I just came from NAIOP in Chicago, and there's a lot of discussion that industrial is still going to go strong. It's just going to be, we're just going to see a pullback because of the economy and some other things that are going on right now that are complicated. But in terms of, like you mentioned it right now, the vacancy rates are still low. I heard the other day that vacancy rates are now at like 3.8%, something like that, on average nationally here in the United States. And when you look at pre-pandemic, they're about 5% nationally. So we're still in this very strong, when you compare to pre-pandemic era of vacancy rates and absorption. But there are people starting to reevaluate what those strategies are.
And that's actually what the feds are hoping for. That is the objective of these interest rate increases, is to temper the economy. So nobody should be surprised at this point that there is a slowdown. I'm not seeing a dramatic correction by any stretch right now, but like you said, I am seeing people tap the brakes a little bit more and just be a little more cautious, or perhaps a little bit more patient, as opposed to when the market is flying. And this last 2 years were the busiest 2 years I've ever seen in industrial real estate in my career. You have to tap the brakes at some point. And going back to the point you made about Amazon, I think it's worth really looking at it from a high level standpoint, that they doubled the amount of warehouse space that they had in 2 years, and they were already one of the world's largest owners or occupiers of industrial space, and they doubled the amount. And that's coming on the back of e-commerce slowly taking away market share, or quickly taking away market share from retailers, the brick and mortar retailers. But that growth also isn't sustainable, because there's a lot of reasons people still want to go to brick and mortar stores. Like you've given a couple of great examples. They want to try something on, or they want to go to a restaurant. There's plenty of reasons why retail will always have a place. And that growth that e-commerce was taken away from retailers, it can't sustain itself at those dramatic increases. But Amazon was trying to accommodate it by growing so aggressively and so fast that it's perhaps not surprising, or shouldn't be surprising to anyone, that they said we might have enough. One point that I also really am glad that you brought up, because it's a huge point that everybody in the logistics space will know, but it's perhaps not known outside of it, is that transportation costs can add up to 50% of a company's expenses of their of a percentage of their revenue, whereas transportation costs can be 5 to 6%. So like you said, it can be 10 times more expensive. So it's still very strategically sound for a company to optimize their warehouse location. If they have to pay a little bit more in their warehouse, but they can save incrementally more as a reflection of their transportation costs, it can still be very strategic. So I think industrial is still going to have strength coming into the next year or so here, but interest rates are rising. That's certainly not going to help anybody that's carrying a lot of debt, and I think it will cause some companies to just pause, as opposed to panicking. I think there'll be a pause. And that NAOP event, I'm curious to hear, like, what is the general sentiment that people had just in regards of coming into the fall from an economy standpoint?
In terms of what aspects, Chad?
Yeah, what was kind of like the sentiment or general takeaway that people had when they're either on the panel or just people that you're speaking to?
Well, yeah, a couple of the people that I listened to there were very specific to supply chain and how that's affecting industrial, right? So a lot of it, what we're seeing now, there's a lot of discussion right now about reshoring, right? And so that's something that was discussed heavily in one of the breakout sessions, and this idea that deglobalization is beginning to happen. Now, what's interesting is, and what I mean by that, by the way, is right now we're heavily dependent on China and Southeast Asia for manufacturing and for production of goods. And what you're seeing right now is, because of the pandemic, there's a lot of companies, a lot of corporations that are a little bit nervous about what it means to have everything shifted, or still over there, I should say, and what it looks like to shift that back to the United States or to Mexico. There's a huge boom right now in Mexico happening for manufacturing and production and warehousing. So you're seeing that happening, and I'll get into some details here in a second. But what you're hearing a lot of is what people call China plus one. So to bring everything from Southeast Asia to the United States is probably not realistic to do, in terms of, at least in the short term. And right now, what we saw during the pandemic, we talked about this last time, container rates. The average container went from anywhere from $2,500, $3,000, maybe on the high side $5,000. It went all the way up to $18,000, $20,000, $25,000 per container, and I've heard some other astronomical numbers as well. And so what you're seeing now is, I've heard anywhere from about 50 to 70% drop in price in container, per container rather, in the last in the last 6 months or so. So what you're seeing now is, although there was a shift towards wanting to mitigate risk and cost in terms of shifting that production back to this side of the hemisphere, right now what you're seeing is people saying, well, you know what, vessel space is becoming more readily available. The cost for containers has gone down. Maybe I'll risk that a little bit more, but I won't risk it fully. I want to have maybe a chance for me to be able to mitigate that risk a little bit by having some manufacturing in Mexico, some manufacturing in the United States. So that's what they're calling that China plus one strategy. Nobody wants to be fully exposed at this point anymore, given what we saw during the pandemic over in Southeast Asia. That's one thing that was being discussed. A lot of the discussion right now in supply chain is What does it look like for the rail to shut down? Right now the numbers, the amount of the dollar amount that is discussed that the rail were to shut down, and all those negotiations are happening right now, is really really staggering. But you're seeing a lot of different things happening right now as we emerge from this pandemic era and this bullwhip effect of inventory. Right now, I don't know if you're seeing in Canada, but in this country, we're seeing a big sub-market emerge, and that is outdoor storage. So a lot of conversations are happening right now about outdoor storage. And what that involves is basically the warehouses are full. We just discussed that the vacancy rates are extremely low right now, and the absorption rates are what they are. And so right now, I got to find space for me to put my inventory somewhere. And what's happening too is the drivers can't drive as much as they were because they're having to, because of the regulations and all these other things. So you have a lot of different factors feeding into this, but what you have essentially is these yards that are being filled up with trucks and containers on chassis, and trailer trucks just parking inventory in these spaces. That's an interesting sub-market that's emerging as well. So there's a lot of different things like that happening that are being discussed that are interesting things to look at as we think about where industrial real estate goes from here. What does the future look like? Especially as we look at the next 3 to 5 years. There's a lot of discussion, or there was, about, you asked this question last time, what does it look like to have automated trucks and trucks that are driverless, and what does the future look like for that? A lot of discussion happening in different panels and breakout sessions about those different topics. The consensus right now is that we're still about 7 to 10 years away from that actually being reality, because of regulations and because of just the technology not quite being there for it to be fully safe for the public to be surrounded by trucks that are completely driverless. In fact, there was a story where apparently a truck was driving a certain lane, and they were trying to test this out, and it misread one of the street signs and it crashed. So we're on a path of that happening, but they still think it's about 7 to 10 years away. So anyway, there's a lot of different topics that are being discussed that are supply chain specific, that are influencing industrial. And I mentioned the driverless trucking, for example, and how that influences industrial, because here's the thing. Remember, we just talked about, when you talk about transportation being 10 times more expensive, or not more expensive, but that is the spend. It's 10 times more than what we see the average company spend on rent in an industrial space. When you start introducing driverless trucks, the cost of those trucks is going to go down, or transportation rather, which will influence also how we view industrial and how close we want that to be to consumers. And we're trying to mitigate the long haul, right? So the cost involved in that. And so if I reduce that, what happens to industrial? So a lot of conversation around that as well.
Yeah, one thing that I always try to stay on top of is just how these developing trends will impact the industrial market. And an interesting one that I think will be well worth following on the electric and driverless vehicles, because I think that there's an electrification underway that is too powerful to stop at this point. I think more and more vehicles will be electric, and they'll include semi trucks, and I think that they will be driverless at some point. And two profound implications on that is, first, these big warehouses are going to need to have more yard storage to hold these trucks, whether they're just charging and they need to stay there for 10 hours to charge, or however long it's going to take them to do it. Even if it's an hour, these vehicles are going to have to get stored somewhere. And some of those older properties weren't built with that in consideration. There's just not adequate room for them to be able to park one of these trailers. And the second one is that there's going to be a big ramp up in demand for electricity. And that's unavoidable because these will all be on the grid. So I think there'll be some offsetting of technology getting better, and perhaps some solar integration to try to wean off the grid itself. But most older buildings, and you could even say like a 10, 15-year-old building, were not designed to have additional yard space to store trucks and trailers until they were charged, nor were they designed with enough power to adequately power all these buildings, trucks going forward. So I think that those are going to be two critical things to watch going forward on how the industry adapts to that. But that will be a challenge. And anytime you introduce new technology, and I think driverless vehicles will be a technology that changes the world, if it's 7 to 10 years out, or perhaps even longer, perhaps shorter, maybe, I think immune to it in our industry. I was going to
absolutely, and in fact, in one of the, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chen.
Oh no, go ahead. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you're fine. No, in fact, some people are saying that driverless technology could be, if not number one, close to that in terms of the biggest influence, what disrupts rather industrial real estate at some point. So all of that will be interesting to keep an eye on. You have a lot of. It was interesting because one of the things that was being discussed was technology in general, and we can circle back to automation and robotics within a warehouse here in a second. But one thing that is interesting to kind of think about and wrap your head around is there was someone that was speaking on this idea about data and technology and the advancement that we're seeing globally in technology, and that is unprecedented. That advancement is happening at a pace that basically humanity can no longer keep up with. And an example in terms of how that influences industrial real estate is they were saying the technology actually exists right now for drones to deliver to your home packages anywhere from 80 to 100 pounds up to that amount, right? And anything below that. So when you think about that, that's a heavy package when you're talking about delivering something door to door. And this idea that these drones can fly in unison when they depart from the warehouse, almost like a pattern of birds, and how they would fly together and flock together. And then when they get closer with their destination, then they separate and go and deliver their goods. When you think about that, it's almost sci-fi, right? But apparently the technology exists to do that. But how do we regulate that? How do we manage that from a just operating a city and having drones fly around? So it's interesting to think about the fact that we have certain technologies that exist right now that actually, when you talk about supply chain and when you talk about warehousing, industrial real estate, all of that stuff is actually emerging, and it's there already. It's a matter of how we're going to manage it and where all this heads. But some of that stuff kind of gets a little bit sci-fi. Even the driverless trucks, like we said, it's probably about a decade away, and so it's interesting to talk about. It's theoretical right now, but we'll see how that all affects things here in the near future, and as we kind of continue to march forward in this very technology-heavy era.
Well, and speaking of that, you alluded to it about the robotics, and I think that's a natural place to segue into, because that's not theoretical. There is a lot of automation already underway that didn't exist before, at least not on the level where an average company can go and start implementing it. It might have been used by the very, very large companies, but now we're starting to see it more and more. It can be something as simple as conveyor belts that have AI built into them, so they know what to be packing or where to be putting it, or lift systems. And it's interesting that we go back to, I don't know if you're a bit of a history buff, but I think of the Luddites, like back in like the early onset of the Industrial Revolution, when they started developing the looms and the different types of equipment that were designed to replace workers. And the Luddites, I think it was Ned Luddite, who was some fictional character. I don't know if he was actually real or not, but he was supposed to be this inspiration for everybody that was fighting back against the machine and trying to stop this technology from stealing jobs. I think fast forward to today, and you start looking at driverless vehicles, which inherently will have no driver involved. And this robotics and automation, same idea. It's designed to take away some faction of the workforce that they would normally a company would have to pay, and the benefits and everything that goes just with employment. It'll just be automation. And that's coming at a pace that I don't think people fully appreciate. And it could, because if they did, I think there'd be more modern day Luddites. Are you seeing something similar to that?
Yeah, definitely. So one thing that we all need to take into account is just the labor market itself, right? So, by the way, why is there hesitation to bring back manufacturing and production from Asia, Southeast Asia, to this country? Well, part of it has to do with the labor market and the costs involved in that, right? So labor will always be a major cost of doing business in any country, but especially in this one. You see a lot of manufacturing going south to Mexico, like I mentioned earlier, and that's in part because of labor down there is cheaper. But so what do you do in this country, for example? Let's focus on the United States right now. What do you do to mitigate against costs, against things like the pandemic era and what that looks like in terms of people not coming to work? What do I do? People all of a sudden start ordering in unprecedented amounts during that era, and yet it was hard to get certain people to get to come to the warehouses and work. And there's other practical things too. I was just talking to somebody, and might sound funny to you, or to the audience, but it's actually a very real thing. I was talking to someone who's saying that this new generation coming up, this person was telling me that they had to approach this person at the warehouse and say, listen, the shift starts at 9. You have to be here at 9 when the shift starts. And this person actually had a hard time understanding that. He thought it was just kind of this, I got to show up at 9. Okay, I'll show up around that time. And they had to have a conversation. No, you have to be here at 9. And so that might sound funny to some of us, but actually these are conversations that are being had with some of these people in the warehouse. And so they're trying to find ways to mitigate against all of those things, right? And not to mention efficiencies that are gained. That's obviously a big, you remove costs out of your operation. You talk about the efficiencies gained to ship an order, to move a package through your warehouse and get it to the end consumer quicker. So what does that look like? Well, for some companies, when you look at Amazon and you type into your computer what an Amazon warehouse looks like on the interior, and you do the same thing for Target, Walmart, Nike, these different places, have incredible logistics platforms and ways of operating. It's pretty staggering to see the automation, the robotics that exist in there. Someone was saying recently that there's something like hundreds of thousands of robots moving around in an Amazon warehouse globally. So it's staggering to think about those things. You look at Tesla right now. Last I heard recently was that they only showed the hands, but they're developing a robot apparently that is something similar to the movies, that we were used to seeing in the movies. But it's interesting to think about that we're heading in a direction that maybe the next 10 years looks like something like that in the warehouse, where we have robots that look a little bit more and more human. But for right now, what these different companies are doing to scale, some of these companies, all they can do is small amounts of automation, small amounts of incremental steps towards better efficiencies. Last time I mentioned a warehouse that I used to work with that, they are not a fully automated warehouse, but they do have what they call cobots, which are essentially these, machines that kind of go alongside the picker as he goes and picks things from these different locations and puts them onto these platforms that are moving alongside them. So, there's that kind of automation too. And those are increasing efficiencies at the warehouse and removing the need for the full need to have dependence on labor in that warehouse. So it's interesting to see where all this is going. I just had a conversation actually recently with a company, and think about this. This is an interesting story. So about a decade ago, I toured a warehouse as we were thinking about occupying or using this as a 3PL for our company. And they were touting their technology within the warehouse and the automation and the IT infrastructure in that within those four walls. And I happened to have lunch with somebody recently who they're a warehouse solutions company that provides IT solutions and basically goes into a warehouse and develops the infrastructure for a warehouse to be automated or to have the correct infrastructure IT-wise to be able to support the technology that's within. And they were talking to me about how this story came up, about how I toured this warehouse with this 3PL a decade ago and how blown away I was. And they told me, you know what? They are a client of ours, and we went to their warehouse recently, and we had to redo the entire infrastructure because it was outdated. So think about that in terms of how the advancement is, how rapid that advancement is in technology. That's only a decade where that all happened. So, but you're correct. There are companies that are relying on automation and robotics that is as small as RF guns and some other things happening, all the way up to what you see at Amazon and everything in between. And you're only going to see that increase. I saw recently where the robotics industry, the automation that's happening is only increasing with time. It's getting cheaper as well, so more companies are taking advantage of it. But before it was more theoretical, where now there's more, there are applications that people can adapt quicker, faster, and cheaper, and implement them in a fast way. So we're going to see that stuff happening here more and more as we think about what the future looks like for industrial real estate.
Well said on that. And there's a thought that occurred to me as you were going through that, and I'll get to that in a second here. But I did see a few people were joined in, so I just want to say hi to some people: Beverly, BC, and Sabrina. Thanks for joining in. If anybody has any questions for Matt, please feel free to put that in the chat. We'll get to as many as we can as well. Thanks to everybody that joined in live, or whether you're listening to this after. Appreciate you being here. It occurred to me as you were going through that, Matt, that if I was China or a Southeast Asian country, I'd be pretty nervous about this advancement in robotics from the sole standpoint that their competitive advantage is cheap labor. And if what you're offering is cheap labor, and that's why they were able to attract so much manufacturing capacity from other nations, not just the US and Canada, but from all over the world. If automation and robotics advances to a level where that gap is narrowed from the amount you spend on labor in China to the amount you spend on US, perhaps that labor shifts from, instead of having 20 warehouse employees, you have 2 data engineers that are monitoring the AI or the system. At some point, if that spread narrows, for all the reasons that we talked about before with reshoring, on why that makes sense to avoid bottlenecks and things being stuck at sea. If you have the the compounding effect that now you don't have those bottlenecks because you don't have to ship it over the ocean. So not only is there that time savings, but if you can actually save on money because your labor costs are cut because you just need less labor. I'd be a little nervous right now if I was a country that relied heavily on manufacturing because of that cheap labor, like China would be. That could be decades in the making before something manifests itself. But I think that's a real possibility that companies will start looking at.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? And the pandemic, I think, highlighted that for everyone, that we are too dependent on manufacturing and production that is, outside of this side of the planet, right? So I think that is an interesting thought, and I think that's exactly why you're circling back to that thought of China plus one, right? Where you're starting to evaluate what that indeed looks like. Now, here's the thing, though. So recently, I heard that to bring all of it back to the United States would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 trillion. Okay, and I think it might have even been more. So when you think about that number, and you start to think about people talking about the fact that, well, container costs have gone down, things seem to start to stabilize here after the pandemic, and container costs are I can swallow that now, and I can, the time frame of how much time I'm spending outside of the LA Long Beach port is shortened as well. It's not what it used to be. Those types of things where. And I'll circle back to the ports in a second because there is an important point there to make. But because the bottleneck is not completely done and we're not completely in the clear here. But I think that people are starting to say, I can, if I take a different strategy in terms of how I order my inventory, if I can be a little bit more nimble in terms of how I purchase things and when I do. Right now, a lot of companies purchase their Christmas goods early so that they had them in the warehouse early. And that way they didn't have to worry about, some of the things they worried about last Christmas season, which is the famous pictures we saw all over the place of empty shelves, right? So they're trying to mitigate all those different types of things. So, if your question about if I'm if I'm a foreign country, am I nervous? I think the answer is maybe. I think that their competitive advantage has been recently in the last couple of decades has been cheaper labor. Although that it's interesting because you saw in different parts. I spent so many years in Asia. You would see it kind of jump around, right? It would go from this part of Asia to this part of Asia to this part of Asia, and so they were trying to figure out where the cheaper labor was constantly. So you've seen a little bit of that happen already in the past, within Asia already. The question will be, will costs go down enough to where we will, think about bringing things back here fully or not? What does all that look like to deglobalize in a way that makes sense for us to evaluate our complete supply chain to to be brought back to this country. But I think that if it does happen, it's still, a little ways away where it completely shifts. There's a lot of chatter right now about chips, right? So these plants that are manufacturing these chips, they're so hard to get. We're so heavily dependent on these chips. They're in cars, they're in microwaves, they're in our phones, they're in everything you can imagine now. And so, what do? Do you rely on a place like China to manufacture these chips? Or do you bring those types of manufacturing plants to this country? And right now, what I'm hearing is that kind of manufacturing plant is actually being brought to this country instead of relying on China. Do we want China to have those chips? Do we want them to control that manufacturing production of those? So there's certain industries that I think are taking a hard look at that, whereas other industries that are more, let's say, apparel heavy, or certain electronics industries, I think, or consumer electronics, I think they're going to, some of this manufacturing is a little bit more complex, and you have the infrastructure already built out in these Asian countries, and it's so expensive to bring back over here. So I think that it's going to be a while before we see a full shift happen.
Yeah, I agreed, and good point on that. And maybe it's wishful thinking on my end, because I think there should be more things made in the U.S., more things made in Canada, more things made in Mexico. Have that pride. Like, I'd rather buy something that I know was made in North America. There's something to be said, made in the USA, made in Canada, made in Mexico. I think inherently, just living here, it'd be no different someone in Germany being proud to have something that was made in Germany. So I think that me being a resident of North America and independent of the costs and time savings, or what the difference is between those, I think it'd be great to have that pride in things being made locally, and I say that broadly as in North America, but that will be something to watch going forward, because there's a lot of pressures and there's a lot of moving parts. And one thing that I've learned from being in this industry for a while now is that nothing exists in a vacuum. There's so many complexities and curveballs that can get thrown your way that it's impossible to accurately, like, we can't even plan what's going to happen next week, because there could be any number of variables that impacted. So I think you just you try to read the tea leaves and see where there's trends developing. You try to stay on top of it. And I mean, anytime you can be proactive other than reactive, I think that's a competitive advantage in its own. But you're right, it's infinitely complex. So we're speculating on what we think could happen in 10 to 20 years. One thing though that I will say is certain though, is that buildings are going to need more power. And so I would suggest that anybody considering moving into a new building, or if you're own an existing building or considering one, go into more depth on what the power is in that property, and also go into depth on what the potential to add more power will be, because for everything we talked about, the electric vehicles, those are going to need to be charged, all the automation, all the robotics, those are all going to require more power, and most of those old warehouse buildings were not designed with that in mind. So I would just be increasingly more conscious that power is going to be a driving force, and it can be the difference between one tenant not even being able to lease the property because it doesn't have adequate power, and leasing another one. So that, even though the trends are evolving and going in directions that nobody can predict, I'm confident that power is going to be a major one. What else do you see, like, as things that are like certain? Like, I love speculating on things. My half of my show is me speculating on what I think is going to happen. But what are you seeing in terms of because you're now in the industry, you've taken all this experience, now you're in this industry. What are you seeing right now as truths, not speculation, but truths? Like, what are some things that you're advising your clients to right now that they should be prepared for or adjusting for?
Wow, tough question. I think that it depends on what client we're talking about, right? So if we're talking about a tenant versus working with a developer, I would have a different answer for you depending on what you're looking for. But
let's do both.
I think we're both. Yeah. So I think when you're talking about developers, I think that, circling back to what we talked about a little earlier in this chat, is that when you look at what's happening right now, everyone's scaling back. We heard about a developer that dropped somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 90 sites, recently. just trying to see where the economy is going to go and what's going to happen. So, and those sites are national, by the way, not just local here to Indiana. But I think that there's still opportunity out there for the developers that have that are able to raise the right kinds of capital and equity and that kind of stuff. So, right now we're seeing a lot of developers going to different parts of the country that, the Carolinas are hot. Texas is still remaining. You look at Austin, Dallas, Houston, different parts of the country like that. So there's still development happening. It's just a matter of, is the developer willing to go to those places and take a look at those different places, and what does it look like for them to basically make a project pencil within this era that, this inflationary era, right? So land, is not used to be a rounding error. It no longer is, things of that nature. So, there are still opportunities out there for the developers that are looking for it and for where it makes sense. But they're starting to slow down for sure. So in terms of, when you're working with different clients, like you mentioned earlier, when space becomes available, especially at certain, right now in this market, we're seeing the space between 20 and 50,000 square feet, it's being gobbled up immediately. There are tenants out there that need that space. And not only where they are fully occupying that space because that's the only space they need, but also as overflow from other facilities where they're in need desperately of extra warehouse space. And so there's a lot of different things factoring into that. But, a lot of it is managing expectations with these different clients where, we're no longer in an era where certain deals can be had, where, right now the landlord has a lot of say because the vacancy rates are so low. So, it's a lot about managing expectations there and making sure that we know what is market value, what can we do to help the client out so that, they're getting a good deal, even though a good deal in this market, right? So I think it's a lot of that. It's just a lot of managing expectations and then, finding the right space for the right people in the right market. I mean, I'm a part of Avis & Young, which is, I'm fortunate enough to where we were able to leverage our multi-market. We have offices all over the world and all over this country, and we work daily with brokers in our from Avis & Young all over the country, and I've been reaching out to contacts, in the Netherlands, Germany, other places as well. So, that's helpful as well to be able to branch out from just being local here. And Indianapolis is incredibly developer heavy for industrial. We have Scannell here, Ambrose. We have a lot of different developers here. We had Duke, who just got bought out by Prologis, that just closed recently. So and there's many others that I could throw out names wise, but we work with a lot of these developers to try to help them out in these different markets and see where what makes sense for them, and other regional players as well that are close by but don't headquarter here in Indianapolis also. So it's a very interesting thing right now to evaluate where we're going, where we're headed because of the economy and what that looks like.
Yeah, and Avis & Young has grown considerably even in the time that I've been in this industry, and great firm. Interestingly, one of the founders of the firm, Graham Young of Avis & Young, was actually from my market. So I believe he started it with somebody in Toronto. I thought it was the Avison guy, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong on that. But yeah, the Graham Young was from my market, so he was one of the founders of the company, and Avison has grown considerably in the last 10 years. So you're with a great firm. I'm sure that combined with your skills, how obviously smart and experienced you are, you'll do very well in this industry. So I look forward to following your career on that. I'm not wrapping up quite yet, Wyatt. I saw there was a couple of usually I try to give like a really good kind word at the end and then wrap it up, and that's when Wyatt's like time to end it, but I'm not ending it quite yet because there were some great questions that came in. If you've got 10 minutes or so, Matt, are you still good for 10 minutes?
Yeah, please. Sure.
BC, thanks for the questions as well. How do you think 3PLs will evolve over the next 5 years? And just before you answer that as well, Matt, if you could even just give a quick explanation on what a third-party logistics company is. I think a lot of people will be familiar with it, but for those who that might be a new term, if you could just explain what a third-party logistics company is, and then how do you think they'll evolve over the next 5 years?
Yeah, sure. So 3PL stands for third-party logistics, right? So it's just short for that. It's the acronym for it. But a 3PL is essentially
let's say I am a company that sells some kind of a consumer electronic. I have the option of either going and working with a landlord, to rent out a space, or to actually go purchase a space, a warehouse itself, and hire people to run the operation for me, and buy a warehouse WMS, a warehouse management system to help me run the warehouse itself and to fulfill the orders to the customer, the end consumer. Or the other option, and I'm oversimplifying, of course, but the other option is to go out and hire what we call a 3PL, which is to do all those things for you. And a 3PL you can be the only customer for that 3PL, or only company for that 3PL in that building, or you might be in a scenario where there are multiple companies that are housing inventory under the one roof of that 3PL that's occupying that warehouse building. So, I've been involved with both. There's, typically if you have a warehouse that if you don't have enough inventory to occupy the entire warehouse, of course, the 3PL is going to have other companies that are occupying that space as well. But basically, in its most basic form, they are running that operation for you, helping you fulfill orders and all those types of things for your company without you having to do that yourself. And there's advantages and disadvantages to that. Do you want to get into real estate as a company, owning or renting space? Do you want to hire and fire people? Do you want to have people managing that space or not? Then with 3PLs, you have the downside is you're negotiating rates, and you're trying to make sure that you're holding them accountable to not only receiving, but storing and shipping your inventory efficiently, and making sure that they carry out projects in a timely manner, and doing it without charging you too much. Or, there's a lot of different things that go into both of those models. And I've experienced both. Towards the latter part of my time in supply chain, I was mainly involved with 3PLs. And so, it just depends on what strategy makes sense for your company.
And how do you see those companies evolving in the next 5 years?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. To be honest, I don't know what. I think the answer is going to be different for every 3PL, of course. When you're talking about some of these 3PLs, you're talking about major companies, global companies that have an unbelievable infrastructure, incredibly brilliant people managing, their operation. And when you talk about, data and IT and different things that involve Six Sigma and all types of intricacies that go into that. But I think it will circle back to what we just discussed. I think you're going to see a larger dependence on automation and robotics and their operations as well. I saw it even as recently as 6 months ago, when I was still managing daily operations for a company where, like I mentioned earlier, they were using cobots in their operation. And this was not an overly complicated, when you talk about automation and robotics type of operation, and even they were introducing it into their everyday, how they function every day. So I think you're going to see that happen. I think you're going to see a lot of companies become more and more dependent on data and the visibility of data and the reporting of data. That's something that was being discussed heavily in Chicago this past week, was data itself and being in front of data and the visibility to good data, because not all data is created equal, right? So I think you're going to see a lot of that happening as well. And the reason why is because you're able to identify where better efficiencies lie, where the waste in the operation exists, where you can find places to reduce costs and take out that waste from your operation. So that when you think about Target, Walmart, and Amazon are the ones that come to mind immediately, a lot of what they do is very data heavy, right? So that's how they're able to make certain evaluations to improve their operation, period. So I think you're going to see a lot of 3PLs adopt those types of things as well. So, a lot of this, it's going to be interesting to see, because, as we start to adapt to this new way of existing with freight and how expensive freight is, it'll be interesting to see how that affects 3PLs also, in terms of where they're located, their cost structure and what that looks like, things of that nature. So, a lot of 3PLs are trying to grow and scale their growth right now, based on the big boom we've seen. I mean, a lot of these industrial spaces are occupied by 3PLs. And so they're trying to figure out what their new normal is too, and trying to figure out, where they find space for their clients and for their customers. And where is that? Can I leverage outdoor storage? And there was a company I was working with in the Netherlands where, at one point, they ran out of space. And so the consumer electronics company that I was with at the time, we brought product into the Netherlands. There was no space to be had. And then the choice was made to bring it to the United States so it could be sold and done something with. In the meantime, while we waited for more space to become available. So the issue of space is a big thing right now. So it'll be interesting to see how 3PLs adapt to that. But I think it's anyone's guess at this point. But a lot of automation and data and those types of things will be influential in terms of how they proceed.
Yeah, 2 points just to add to that really quickly. I'm glad you mentioned that 3PLs occupy a lot of the warehouse inventory, because for people that are just getting into industrial real estate, they're often confused at who occupies all this space, because I've heard people say, well, Amazon only needs so much space and there's FedEx only needs so much space, and that is true, but these 3PLs occupy a considerable amount of the warehouse inventory, so being familiar with them is very important in my mind. And the other thing that I'd add on is that one thing that's more of a buzzword than I've ever heard before is ESG, the environmental social governance. That's driving a lot of internal conversations with companies that I'm hearing right now. So I could see a lot more, instead of the lip service that has been paid for a lot of time. I see there being a lot more attention given to that ESG. So whether that's solar panels on the roofs or more environmentally friendly construction materials, that's a topic in itself that we could explore another time. But I think that there will be a lot more focus on that ESG side, not just for 3PLs, but for everyone. Another question from Raymond. Thanks for joining in. And the question, could you please expand on Northeast market, New Jersey industrial market specifically?
Well, interesting. I actually, while I was in Chicago, actually had a conversation with one of the heads of a development company out in New Jersey. So we had a brief conversation about that market, actually. It's interesting because New Jersey is so starved for land to develop on, right? So there's a lot of redevelopment happening out there out east, and especially in New Jersey. So in fact, when we talked to this developer, one of the things he mentioned was, the projects that they typically are drawn to and that they're used to penciling and trying to figure out the math for are redevelopment projects, right? So just because out there the land is so tough. So I'm not as familiar, out with the east, the Northeast market as I am the market I'm in, of course. But I think that it's going to be interesting to observe. I know this developer was talking about rather. And you've mentioned this before, Chad, I know, with other people, and it's something that's been discussed widely too in different conversations I've had with people. Is a lot of people are growing a little weary right now with industrial real estate. So they either don't want it in their market anymore, or they there's certain things where they think that for whatever reason, some people are just don't want it around because of the different things that they think it might bring to that area, or whatever the case might be. New Jersey, I've heard, is becoming that way a little bit too, where there's certain areas they just don't want industrial development happening in. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that market. But that's the extent of what I know about New Jersey right now in terms of the conversations I've had recently.
Yeah, and Raymond, I'll aim to bring somebody on from that market specifically as well to address that. From my observations, and I'm not in that market myself either, but from my observations, it's one of the major ports in North America. And not only that, but you're within close proximity to the majority of the population, at least in the US. So anytime you can be in a direct port market where we've talked about how crazy that market is right now, and then you're also within a truck drive away from a huge amount of the population. That's different than having to bring things into the West Coast, send it by truck to a rail facility, and then it goes across the country by rail, and then goes by another truck. It's a lot more efficient to just bring that in on the port. And like Matt was saying, if some of these these jurisdictions, and I think it'd mostly be blue states because I can't see Texas or Florida doing this anytime soon, but California and New York, if they start taking an approach, and there's evidence of this too, this isn't even hearsay, there is evidence that there is growing backlash against the warehouse industry. If they take the approach that they're going to start capping the amount of development for industrial, then all that industrial that already exists by extension will go up in value because it'll be finite if they can't add any more. So the options would be to reroute it to another port or send it more inland, and that's not efficient either. So I would be pretty bullish on a market like New Jersey right now. There's so many variables beyond that, though. Like, it's that doesn't mean someone can just go and buy a property and expect to get wealthy off of it. There's still deal metrics that go into it, but as a market as a whole, for those reasons, I'd be bullish about it. But I will aim to bring somebody on specifically on that. So thanks for the question, Raymond. Warehouse investor, how are low river levels impacting, or is it media hype? So I'm guessing he's talking about the Mississippi. I saw the other day that it's at like decade lows for the amount of water in there, and then that's causing some of the barges to bottom out or not even being able to travel. How I don't follow that enough to know how much commercial transportation is going on the river, but I'm assuming it's a lot. What's your take on this? Is this just contributing to more supply chain bottlenecks?
Yeah, it's interesting. You were mentioning the ports earlier. And I'll kind of answer it this way. What we're seeing right now is, and I heard, how much truth to this there is, I'm not sure, but it is what I heard recently, so I'll take it for face value. But, last winter, we saw, those famous images of 100+ vessels being, stationed outside of LA Long Beach and waiting to get into the port, right? So what's happening now is that because of emissions and the amount of emissions that these vessels are, what happens with these vessels, right? That going back to the ESG topic, right? Well, they don't want them close to the port as they were last year. Mm-hmm. So apparently the backlog is still there. They're just further out. We just can't see them, right? And so they're still there. But what's happening now, I mentioned that because people are starting to go around the LA Long Beach port into other ports, okay? Savannah, East Coast, in the South, et cetera. So what's happening right now is that people are willing to pay a little bit more and wait a little longer for that to happen so they don't get stuck out at sea on these vessels or get stuck in this bottleneck, which, by the way, is an issue right now between the port and then, the rail right now. There's a bottleneck right now happening between that port and that end warehouse. So, which is contributing, by the way, back to the outdoor storage. So you're seeing a bigger dependence on rivers and on other ports than we have ever had seen in the past, and people wanting to use other ports and rivers to leverage to better mitigate rather the risk of what we're seeing or what we have seen in the past, or what was going on the West Coast especially. So I think that there's definitely a greater volume of goods traveling. Let's say via river. Now, what that looks like in the upcoming months and a year from now, I'm not sure, once things start to stabilize, at these other ports. But for now, that's one of the reasons why we're seeing a larger volume travel via these rivers.
Thanks for answering the question. That was BC. I think BC had another question, if I'm not mistaken, too, Wyatt. And Raymond, thank you for the question. Green tech in warehouses, what's coming? Yeah, I'm thinking on like the ESG front, it's coming. Like, solar panels will be on more roofs in the coming few years than I think anybody is understanding. I actually did a short video on this because I'm fascinated by it. But in the US alone, there's about 21.5 billion square feet worth of industrial real estate. So that's 21.5 billion square feet of roofs, the majority of which aren't being used for anything. That's a huge opportunity. And actually, the example that I gave is that if anyone's familiar with Solar Star in California, it's one of the world's largest solar farms. It occupies, I believe it's 3,200 acres. So obviously that land can't be used for anything other than desert anyways, but it still occupies 3,200 acres. So there's only so much of that land that will be available, and you also have to get it to the end user. So it probably doesn't make a lot of sense to be building the transmission lines from running it from the desert all the way to the East Coast. So there will be a lot more warehouses that have solar panels on them. And the example I gave, you take all those 21.5 billion square feet, it's the equivalent of 150 solar farms the size of Solar Star. So there's a huge opportunity either for owners of the property to harness their own solar energy and use it internally, or sell it back to the grid. One idea, and I want to get your thoughts on this too, Matt. One idea that's incredibly compelling to me, and it's one that I'm very fascinated in following, is that there will be companies that actually start renting roof space to put solar panels on it, and they'll pay rent the same way a tenant inside the building would. But now the solar company has enterprise value on itself, because they're collecting that solar power and distributing it or selling it. And then the property owner now is getting additional revenue. So instead of doing the solar panels themselves, they lease it out, and now they just add that as net operating income. So you start seeing the potential on that. If you're renting out, if you've got a massive facility and you can rent out and make an extra $100,000 a year, and maybe those numbers are way out of whack. I'm not in the space to actually know what's economically viable right now. But just for argument's sake, if you add $100,000 of NOI to your property, doing nothing else, you didn't increase the footprint, you didn't make any sizable changes, the company that leases it will have that as their business, and then the property owner just adds that to their net operating income. You just cap that income. You could see what that could actually mean. So that's one where I think there's going to be tremendous development, and it will change. It will look completely different than what I'm envisioning 10 years ago, but I see solar panels on virtually every roof at some point in the future. What do you think on that?
Well, yeah, I'm not well versed enough in the green tech area to fully, give a comprehensive answer. But I will say this: I think oftentimes when we think of warehouses, at least if you're not in the space and operating in the space daily, we often think of these warehouses as being the new warehouses that are being built, and the ones that are brand new with the latest and greatest in lighting and all those different things. But a lot of these warehouses that are in the market now are older, right? I mean, it's not unusual for me to come across a building that is 30, 40 years old and needs substantial things done to it to bring it back to a place where it's kind of user friendly, right? But I think what recently, for example, we were touring a building that needed all their lights replaced, and not just because of the lighting in the warehouse itself and what that meant in terms of the brightness and the work area, but what implications that had for in terms of the usage of electricity itself. And when you replace all of it with new LED lighting, for example, how that can make that warehouse more efficient and reduce the electricity being used. And so although there is an initial cost to do that, when you look at the 10-year, 5-year, 10-year return on your investment in terms of the cost of electricity and all those different things, your return is pretty substantial. And the government, at least locally here, is willing to help out with a lot of incentives when you start to do those things. So solar panels are the same thing. There's a lot of incentives involved with local governments to want to make that happen for obvious reasons. So I would say that, there's kind of low-hanging fruit like that when you talk about LED lighting and things like that in older buildings. I think a lot of it will depend on, or a lot of it will also involve rather materials that are less damaging to the environment. When you talk about what's involved with building these warehouses themselves, the footprint that these large warehouses have a massive footprint, right? And so, what is involved with those materials to build those facilities, I think will play a part in as well. So those are the ones that come to mind immediately. I think there's going to be an increased amount of regulation that you'll see coming out, especially in the next couple of years, for holding warehouses, industrial warehouses, industrial spaces accountable to their emissions, and factories as well. So it'll be interesting to see what that looks like. But, when you look at different spaces that are, this is why we have, we work with environmental guys all the time. They have to go do a phase 1 on these properties and check them out and make sure that they're even, you can build on them and, for obvious reasons. And so it's interesting to see that, it's not only about what the future holds, but also, how can we retrofit these different spaces and the land that they're being built on to make sure that they're environmentally friendly, for what's existing already.
Yeah, well said. I know that there was a question. I don't see it anymore, but someone asked what shirt you were wearing.
What shirt?
What shirt?
The sweater or the shirt?
We probably should say, but there, Juan, maybe Juan, or maybe Juan's just very impressed with your sense of fashion. So I guess you could do sweater and shirt.
Well, here's the thing. So I'm 6'8". If I stood up, I'd be like outside of the frame, and yes, I used to play basketball. I'm sure that's the next obvious question. I had the chance to play for Purdue University. So I mentioned that because the one store that fits me well is Banana Republic. So just about my entire wardrobe is from what we call it the BR. I like their sense of style, and it also fits me well. So anyway, but I appreciate the question.
And once you find something that works, you just got to stick with it. So yeah,
you gotta stick with it.
So we will wrap up. I apologize. I went an extra 10 minutes, but we just had so many great questions, and I wanted to get your insights on that. I've left your contact information at Avison. I've also left your LinkedIn, so I encourage people to reach out to you. Any other best way to get in touch with you?
No, those are good ways. I would love, here's the thing. I enjoy learning. I don't pretend to know it all. We talked about this last time. Anyone who tells you they figured out supply chain or knows everything about it is lying to you. It's an ever-evolving industry, very complex industry. We talked about this last time. The average shipment leaving Southeast Asia involves 10 to 12 different companies for it to get it from that factory over to the end warehouse in this country. There's so many moving parts. And so, I welcome any questions, any feedback, anything like that. I'd love to stay in communication with anybody. So definitely reach out, and I look forward to hearing from you guys. And this is great.
Yeah, and Matt, we'll definitely keep in touch, and I'd love to have you back again. Perhaps we can look for something in like second quarter of 2023, because I love chatting. The same with you. I love to learn, and you have a ton of insight on that. One quick mention as well. Every week I put out a weekly newsletter where I do a roundup of all the news that I've come across in the previous week. I don't publish it anywhere. I only send it out by email. So you can go to industrialinsiders.com, sign up for free. If you're not getting any value, you can unsubscribe anytime. But it's that list is actually growing at a good pace. And I basically just do a summary of the important things that I'm learning. Just like you, Matt, I'm trying to stay on top of things, and I have that curiosity of always trying to find new things. So if you want to go over and subscribe, feel free to do that. And lastly, if you don't mind just hitting that thumbs up button as well, or hit the thumbs down button if you didn't like this. Any feedback is good feedback, but I really do appreciate you tuning in, and catching the next episode. And Matt, will be in touch.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks, Chad.